Thank you, Acting President. Those of you who support this legislation don't get libertarians and probably never will, so I won't bother misquoting Voltaire or giving you a political lecture. There is little point trying to explain my philosophy to someone who thinks Animal Farm is an agricultural textbook. Let's just say it's astonishing that while hundreds of thousands of people are risking their lives to fight authoritarianism in Hong Kong, we are even considering legislation of a kind that would get a big thumbs up from an authoritarian state. For the record, I don't understand authoritarians either, and I doubt I ever will. I don't understand how you can expect people to tolerate diversity and the life choices and opinions of minorities, but you won't tolerate theirs. As Orwell put it, it's like you believe some animals are more equal than others. I understand that those who support this legislation see yourselves as the good guys in some sort of culture war. But I'm reminded of that comedy sketch by Mitchell and Webb where there's two Nazis that come to the realisation that they're suddenly the bad guys. I don't mean to call anyone here a Nazi, far from it. But the dictionary definition of a bigot is a person who shows intolerance towards those who hold different opinions to yourself. Racism, bigotry, misogyny, sexism, and any other isms that you can think of are all about fear of otherness. As far as I can see, those that support this legislation fit the definition, so I'm sorry to say you're the bad guys. The great problem with those who want to curb free speech is always who decides. What offends people is subjective. For example, every year in Melbourne there's a conference on Marxism, where people talk about the virtues of an ideology that led to the deaths of tens of millions of people. Many of the surviving victims have fled to my electorate, Vietnamese, Cambodians and Ethiopians, and Chinese, and people from Eastern Europe, to name a few. The fact that these great people and their descendants are now my neighbours may be the only worthwhile legacy of this abhorrent ideology. Suggesting Marxism is good to someone whose family was slaughtered by Pol Pot is one of the most offensive things I can imagine. But I do not expect the state to clamp down on it. That's because that's exactly the kind of thing that former refugees in my electorate were fleeing from. I know former Senator George Brandis upset people when he said people have a right to be a bigot. I think he expressed that quite poorly. Bigotry is not a right in any statement that I've seen, but free speech definitely is. In fact, free speech is enshrined in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, that great statement that was guided by the Labor luminary Doc Evatt. For any young people who might be watching, perhaps I can explain. This was back in the days when the Labor Party stood for people other than urban elites, and a time when the Liberal Party were more liberal. For the record, I hold bigots in just as much contempt as Marxists. But the best way to expose them is to let them talk and allow them to be criticised just as freely. They condemn themselves.
Doesn't stop bigots.
By making them victims, we give them far more importance than they deserve, and we are ultimately better off knowing who the idiots are. As pathetic as some neckbeard posting sexist remarks on the internet is, in my eyes they are far less dangerous than those of you who would turn Victoria into a police state. But let's put aside our ideological differences and look purely at the practicalities of whether this legislation will work. Will it actually prevent vilification? I will use as an example, held up for a reason for the legislation. This is the case of the female athlete who was subjected to disgusting comments online. I won't name her because it's not about her. So that you can fully understand this, you'll have to forgive me, but I'll need to repeat the comment that caused the controversy. I do not condone the language, but I need to so that you can understand it fully. I do this knowing full well that some people will think that even talking about it is outrageous, when supporting this legislation is worse by several magnitudes. It's sad to say this is how outrage culture works these days. The specific online abuse that this woman received reportedly came from a teenage Collingwood supporter from the outer suburbs. In reference to a photograph of her playing sport, the man commented it was about an inch away from the full ham sandwich. Allow me to pause here and say that if that made you feel uncomfortable repeating this comment here, imagine how much worse it would be over months of public discussion if this legislation ever passed. The athlete was rightly disgusted. The athlete was rightly disgusted by it because it was a disgusting comment. Personally, I doubt anyone thinks any lesser of her. However, the man who said it vilified himself, and you can still find his name online. It remains to be seen if this would actually qualify as vilification in law. Did it denigrate her personally, or was it just a crude description of a body part? If it doesn't qualify under law, then this legislation is useless. I'm told the intention of this legislation is that people would not be locked up for their beliefs because cases would most likely be resolved through mediation with VCAT. I don't pretend to know about the inner workings of VCAT, but let me speculate for a moment. Let me speculate for a moment how this is likely to play out. I'm willing to bet that whoever mediates on this would likely not be from the same world as the young Collingwood supporter who posted the abuse. I would speculate that their name might be Jacinta, Ellen or Annabelle. They would have attended a private school and gone to a university where they studied law and gender studies. They would enjoy hot yoga and warm chai lattes and not know very much about football. The young man might not be the sharpest tool in the shed, but he would know pretty quickly that the fix was in. And he would recognise class warfare when he saw it.
Get captured in this act.
Now stop me whenever you think that this is making the situation better rather than worse. He or his mates might send anonymous notes to Jacinta or Ellen about anything they liked, and she would have no immediate recourse other than to take stress leave. Maybe she would then sue VCAT for a mental breakdown. But let's assume that going on stress leave and suing VCAT, Jacinta, Ellen or Annabelle bravely battles through their first ever encounter with a working class person and manages to send the case to the magistrate's court. Now it's a case of lawyers at 20 paces and media everywhere. The police might use their powers to obtain personal information and search through the defendant's internet history. He would suddenly look like the victim. This would cause another round of reporting. How will our defendant afford a lawyer? He may require crowdfunding, and in order to get crowdfunded, he'll need publicity. News Limited papers, Sky News and some talkback will say he's being bullied, as they are already speculating on now, and support his right to free speech. The Age and the ABC will be horrified on behalf of the upper middle class. This would be a classic culture war of the modern kind. Meanwhile, lawyers will claim that this is in the wrong jurisdiction and it will be left to existing federal legislation which can be used to prosecute people using a carriage surface to cause offence, or existing state law prohibiting conduct which causes mental harm. This is exactly the kind of mess that occurs when you make something triple illegal. Since there are no precedents, this would then be tied up in lawfare for some time while everyone else debates it. And if anyone were wondering why it is that it's wholeheartedly supported by the Law Institute of Victorian, you can stop wondering now. Lawyers recommending this legislation is like vampires recommending rusty razor blades. Liberty Victoria didn't respond to my query, I might add. Now, let's assume that this case does wind up before a court of law for determination. This will take much more time. In Victoria, the Magistrates Court has a huge backlog of cases, many involving extremely serious cases of violent offences that are delayed for years. But let's imagine he's declared guilty. Maybe he'll be fined and he'll once again crowdsource it. Maybe he'll refuse to pay and even be jailed or become a minor celebrity. Rather than suppressing this kind of language, it's more likely to become part of our parlance. As a fellow campaigner on the decriminalisation of drugs, I take my hat off to Ms Patton, but she should know that drug laws make little difference to the availability of drugs because getting around the laws is easy. This law will make little difference to vilification of people in exactly the same way. Rather than stopping online abuse, the invective is more likely to just become anonymous and more personal, like notes slipped under doors. And far from stopping suicide, it will make public discourse cruder and will divide people. It will create exactly the kind of debates that people said would cause suicides during the lead up to the same-sex marriage plebiscite. Meanwhile, the offence industries will grow fat on the culture wars. Perhaps the feminist Clementine Ford could find herself before court explaining her tweets that all men must die. Fiona Patton herself could be held to account for calling Malcolm Roberts a dick, as she did in a press release a while ago, or a video that the Sex Party released which implied Catholic priests were pedophiles. And probably more likely, none of these people will ever be charged. And people will wonder why the urban elites are exempt, or why some animals are more equal than others. And all of it will be a colossal waste of time and resources. Looking at the bigger picture, this is the kind of law that caused a remarkable backlash in the Western world against the political class. It led to the election of Donald Trump in the United States, Brexit in the UK, and Scott Morrison winning an unwinnable election. During my first speech, I said, and I quote, "I reject identity politics. I've been saddened by the rise of authoritarians on both the left and right, attempting to declare certain sections of society as good or bad. Pitting man against woman, black against white, and Christian against Muslim is a recipe for social chaos. End of quote. This legislation is the recipe I was talking about. The Liberal Democrats reject identity politics, we support free speech, and we condemn this draconian legislation.